Thanks for having me. Thanks also to Amitabh, who first suggested we come together for this conversation. My job as the moderator is very simple today because everyone here is an expert. And even among the audience, we have many experts. So I'm going to introduce the panel formally, and then I have a set of questions. We'll just go around the panel and we'll have 2 or 3 of the panelists responding to each question. We'll take audience questions at the end. So if you have questions that come up as we are speaking, please have them on chat. We'll collect them, but we'll only ask the panelists to respond towards the end. So our first panelist today is Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us. She was the Foreign Secretary in the Government of India from 2009 to 11, and also served as the spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs. She was our High Commissioner in Sri Lanka and also an ambassador to China and to the United States. I first met her at the archives in Delhi, at the National Archives and at Teen Murti, when she was researching her book, The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 62. If you haven't read the book, I encourage everyone to pick it up. I think it's a great introduction to many of the things we'll be discussing today. Our second panelist is Ms. Yudon Okatsang, who's now serving her 4th term as an elected member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. She has over 22 years of experience working on various issues affecting Tibet and Tibetans in different capacities, such as with the Tibetan Women's Association and the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, and also the Empowering the Vision project. Those of you who are from Delhi might have seen in Majnu Ka Tila, the hub that Empowering the Vision project has established. It's a great space for both for meeting young Tibetans, but also for talks, movie screenings, and events like this. So do check it out when you are in Delhi next. We have Mr. Sherab Voser, who is the Regional Field Director of the Tibet Fund in India and Nepal. He has also about 2 decades of experience as an activist, journalist, researcher, and development worker. Before joining the Tibet Fund, he was a senior fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute of the Central Tibetan Administration. But on this panel today, he is one of the voices from outside the CTA, so we are lucky to have his perspective. Mr. Amitabh Mathur is a co-founder of Deepstrat. He served for 32 years as a career intelligence official and was special secretary at RAW before he was elected to head the Aviation Research Center, a federal technical intelligence organization under the Government of India's Cabinet Secretariat. Most importantly for us, he served as a special advisor at the Ministry of Home Affairs on Tibetan affairs. So he is intimately familiar with many of the issues that we are discussing today. And in this role, he forged a close relationship with the government in exile, as well as with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other religious leaders. We also have Ms. Kate Saunders with us. Thank you very much for joining us across time zones. Ms. Saunders is a writer and author who has specialized in Tibet for more than 20 years. Leading fieldwork in Asia and also mentoring researchers and open source monitors, briefing parliamentarians, engaging in UN advocacy in Geneva, and leading teams and managing media public relations for high profile events such as visits by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She was a head of research for the International Campaign for Tibet, where she managed a field operation of Tibetan researchers, interviewing Tibetan sources and writing analyses on the situation. She's currently working on a report investigating issues around the Dalai Lama's succession, which is one of the questions we will pick up today, and a research project called Cartographies of Coercion, combining Tibetan research expertise with other think tank work. She's also produced many reports on Tibet and a book on the Chinese system called 18 Layers of Hell, Stories from the Chinese Gulag. So thank you very much to all the panelists for joining us today. We are Very privileged to have you, and to our audience members for taking the time today to join us. Um, I now hand it over to Amitabh, who will tell us just a little bit about what led us to do this, why we are doing it now, what the imperative behind this is. So over to Amitabh. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. May I also add my welcome to the co-panelists and those of you who have tuned into this webinar on Tibetans in India, their hopes, anxieties, and expectations. From the time the Dalai Lama sought refuge in India in 1959, conditions of Tibetans under Chinese occupation have gone from bad to worse. Deposing before a congressional committee in the US, Sikyong Pempasering said, unless China is made to reverse its policies, Tibetans and Tibet are on the verge of a slow death. The Dalai Lama, who has been the symbol of Tibetan struggle in the last 65 years, is now 88. And his advancing age has inevitably led to concerns as to what will happen after him, what will happen to the institution of the Dalai Lama, what will happen to the Tibetan civilizational struggle, and what will happen to the Tibetans who are in India. Tibetans, with their faith in the institution of reincarnation, have deep attachment to their religious leaders, the most important and highest of whom is the Dalai Lama. Devotion and loyalty to him is not merely because of the political position he has held over the centuries, but because of his religious eminence. In the last 60 odd years that he has been in exile, veneration for him has not declined, in fact, increased even within Tibet. Over 160 Tibetans have committed self-immolation seeking the return of His Holiness to the homeland. Naturally, an authoritarian regime cannot countenance an institution which it cannot control and whose influence has only increased, not diminished. Hence, with plans to take over leadership of the Tibetan people, it has declared, on the basis of some dubious historical precedent, that the atheist communist regime will now determine who the 14th Dalai Lama's reincarnation will be. On the other hand, the Dalai Lama has made it quite clear that he will only decide on his future course at the age of 90, he's 88 now. But he has made some things very clear. Firstly, that in case there is a reincarnation, it will not be in a country that is not free, which means it rules out Tibet under Chinese occupation. He has also warned against any Chinese interference in the process of the reincarnation. So what we may perhaps see in all likelihood is that there will be two Dalai Lamas, and the Chinese will precipitate the situation in the hope that that will divide the Tibetan community. The Central Tibetan Administration, Tibetan religious leaders, Tibet support groups, Tibetan lay people have already issued statements that they would like His Holiness to reincarnate. They have also stated quite clearly that reincarnation is a religious matter that lies between His Holiness, his wishes, and the Tibetan people. The US Policy and Support Act too has clearly stated that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama is his business and that of the Tibetans, and no country should interfere in it. Government of India, which hosts the Dalai Lama, and the Central Tibetan Administration, and half the Tibetan diaspora, is yet to indicate its mind on this subject, at least publicly. Such silence has the danger of giving rise to avoidable misgivings. Though historically he has been both the political and spiritual head of the Tibetan people, the Dalai Lama gave up his political role in 2011. There is now an elected Tibetan parliament, there is a government, there are ministers, there are departments. And it seems like a de facto government tacitly recognized as such by the government of India. Yet it is the Dalai Lama who is seen as the embodiment of the Central Tibetan Administration and as its driving force within India and the world. There are fears that in the vacuum that may occur once His Holiness is no more, Tibetan unity, which had been brought together by him in exile, will fragment, it will splinter, the CTA will become ineffective, a toothless body, more of a liability than an asset to Government of India. Chinese hopes are based on this. In such a situation, the Chinese hope that international support will taper off and financial assistance will dry up. The Tibetans may become leaderless. I may add that regional divisions that have come to the fore recently do not augur well, and there is a need for serious thought on the unity of Tibetans. The Tibetan community in India, which at one time used to number around 90,000, is now down to about 60,000. Most of the people who have left are young people. Uncertainty prevails amongst those youngsters left behind about their future. They do not believe they will ever return to Tibet. They perhaps do not even wish to return to Tibet. They are neither refugees, nor foreigners, nor permanent guests, as His Holiness likes to describe himself. They have made a living here in the settlements, and they perhaps tend to lose all these perks in case they take Indian citizenship. Both the CTA and Government of India have been silent on this matter, and I think some reassurance or some strategic view needs to be indicated. Lastly, with the serious downturn in Indo-China relations following Chinese military aggression in Ladakh, calls have been made to the effect that India should now recalibrate its Tibet policy. Basic demand is that India should cease to consider Tibet as part of China and treat it as a country under occupation. This perhaps is easier said than done. With these, I conclude my introductory remarks. Thank you, Swati, and over to you.
Thank you, Amitabh, for those remarks, for getting us started. So the first question I had for the panel is, what is India's position, whether stated or unstated, on Tibet, on the Tibetan political struggle, and the question of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation? Should the government of India be doing anything differently on any of these, on Tibet, on the political struggle, and on the question of reincarnation? So I first invite Ambassador Nirupama Rao to come in on this question, and then, based on her remarks, we might have responses from other panelists. So over to Ambassador Rao.
Which we basically affirm that Tibet is an autonomous region of China, which somehow seemed to trigger off a host of reactions as to questioning why the government of India had to make such a statement. Now, when it comes to the issue of Tibet, and I have dealt with this at length in my recently published book, it goes back really to the early 1950s when we gave up what some may call our imperial privileges in Tibet, and the political office in Lhasa became the Consulate General of India there. Of course, that consulate was closed down in 1962, and the agreement that we had signed with China on the Tibet region of China, and in which we had basically affirmed, and perhaps this gets missed in the fog of history, we had basically affirmed that Tibet was a part of China in 1954. And in terms of reworking our policy and putting it in reverse gear after all that had been stated, you can well imagine the dilemmas facing the policy-making establishment in New Delhi. The question here is to what extent we can influence the course of events in Tibet today, whether we can really reverse the whole issue of Chinese control. In a sense, basically you are trying to deal with the geopolitics of this region and the fact of Chinese possession, control, domination over Tibet. Of course, the presence of this large Tibetan refugee community, this exodus that took place from Tibet in the late 1950s and continued more or less till about a decade ago, but which has literally been shut off because the Chinese now control the exit of Tibetans out of Tibet. And we really don't get a fresh influx of people coming in from there. But the fact is, this exodus, it's almost become like the children of Israel, I think, scattered all across the world today, not just in India. People in search of a homeland. And here, you know, when I was reading Patrick French's book, he quotes from Hugh Richardson. He speaks of Richardson quoting the Henry Newbolt and saying the mind's Tibet where none has gone before. The mind's Tibet. And I think we're all in search of that mind's Tibet, because where does it really exist today? When we speak about the succession to the 14th Dalai Lama, of course, His Holiness has pronounced, I think, very clearly in 2011, when he spoke about the fact that, and I quote from it, when I'm about 90, I will consult the High Lamas of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the Tibetan public, and other concerned people who follow Tibetan Buddhism, and re-evaluate whether the institution of the Dalai Lama should continue or not. On that basis, we will take a decision. So everything seems to be in a state of flux. But I think beyond that, beyond the question of who the 15th Dalai Lama will be, or whether there will be a 15th Dalai Lama, the whole question of the future of Tibet. Now, my first visit to Tibet was in 1986, when I went into Western Tibet on the pilgrimage to Kailash and Mansarovar, and I saw the detritus, literally the impact of the cultural revolution on that part of Tibet, the ruined monasteries, the effect on the local population. And then when I went back in 1992, when I visited Lhasa and Shigatse, of course, it was a completely different Tibet that I saw, again, very growing to be very sinicized, not completely so perhaps. When you walked around the Jokang in Lhasa, it still felt, you could feel, the mind of Tibet, literally. But today, all that, I think, is well behind us. So that the question of Chinese control over Tibet. Now, I saw, there have been numerous calls, especially within India. Somehow there is the feeling among, I don't say just the intelligentsia, I mean the larger public, that somehow we lost Tibet. And I've always asked, was Tibet ours to possess in the first place? Tibet has been a spiritual place of spiritual pilgrimage for so many Indians. And somehow we go back to Sardar Patel's letter of 7th November 1959 and somehow feel that, Nehru's policy on Tibet could have been expressed differently, and that somehow we could have left the question of Tibet's status quite open and the rest of the world would follow. But unfortunately, that is not the way geopolitics played itself out during the Cold War. I think Tibet became the Cinderella, literally, of so many countries. We forgot Tibet, the British did too, and the Americans perhaps wanted to help to some extent in the beginning, but I think they were absorbed with their involvement in the Korean War and the whole who lost China debate within McCarthyist, the politics of the United States at that time. So somehow Tibet's story has been buried and embedded in the matrix of so many other geopolitical issues, and to extricate it from that. I know that the US Department of State today has in a sense woken up to this issue and is talking about much more involvement in helping the Tibetan community, which I think is a good thing. But on the question of Tibet's status, calling it an occupied territory or saying that we will reverse the stand that the government of India has taken on the issue of Tibet all these years, I think that may be very aspirational. It's true. It's something that perhaps should appeal to all of us who would want the Tibetan people to have a really genuine autonomy for themselves, as Lodi Gyari himself speaks of in his book. But that perhaps, is going to be an extremely complicated issue. And I think for us, all people who love democracy and freedom and human rights, I think what we need to work together with other like-minded countries is to support the question of genuine autonomy. I don't define autonomy as freedom. I don't believe that is something that really can be achieved. But genuine autonomy, cultural, religious, and in terms of an identity, that identity for the Tibetan people has to be preserved. There is the question of trust between the Tibetan exiles and the Chinese government. There is a total absence of such trust today. And the breakdown of dialogue between the Tibetan exile establishment and the Chinese Communist Party since the mid-2000s, since about 2008, I believe, it has been unfortunate, because I have always been an advocate personally of dialogue between the Tibetan community in exile and the Chinese Communist Party. And that has to, something has to give on that front, because if we are to resolve the question of the Tibetans in exile and their future, and the survival of this community, there are two choices before us. One is, of course, that they continue, in this state of a very purgatorial state, literally, scattered across various countries, trying to preserve their specific identity and their personality. Or on the other hand, we see a solution worked out between the Chinese government and the Tibetan community in exile, on the lines of what the late Lodi Gyari, who I am proud to call a friend, tried so much to do. And when I look at his book, and I see what happened in 2011, when the Tibetans, the Dharamsala establishment, decided not to go ahead with the dialogue with the Chinese. I think, the rest, of course, is what we see today. But I would like to quote from Lodi Gyari's book here, when he says, "Let me be very clear. The Tibet issue will not go away unless and until the grievances and wounds of the Tibetan people are addressed and healed. Building highways, airports, and glitzy townships is not the remedy. The only cure is for the PRC government to be responsive to the genuine aspirations of the Tibetan people." And then he says, "To my fellow Tibetans, with equal seriousness and conviction, we must take advantage of the compassion and vision of our leader, His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, and under his guidance, try to find a place for the Tibetan people within the PRC. We must stop fooling ourselves with empty slogans. We must wake up from our make-believe world." And I think he also has some genuine advice for the Central Tibetan Administration, that, of course, while we must all dedicate our energy and experience to maintaining the distinct identity of the Tibetans, the work that the CTA does should be that of a civil society organization. And I think that's really very important to keep in mind. I'll stop because I know that I must be eating up the time of the other distinguished speakers. But that's where maybe I'll end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And just very quickly, this is the book. It's now available in India, so do read it, get it. It's available easily online. And I also wanted to mention this report. We have someone from the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives here that was recently released. So do get a copy if you haven't already. Amitabh, do you want to quickly come in on this question before we move to the next one? Maybe just a minute or two, and then we move on.
No, but at some stage, yes, I would like to ask, I would like to ask Ambassador Rao whether, if the opportunity arises, should we nudge the two parties to resume formal talks? the Chinese have been in touch with His Holiness on and off. I don't think they're going to ever talk to the Central Tibetan Administration, as long at least as His Holiness is around. Is there an opportunity we missed? Is there an opportunity? If the opportunity presents itself, should we take this first step?
Yeah, Amitabh, I've always felt that on this point, the government of India has been very hesitant to take a position and to really speak out in favor of dialogue between the two sides. And I think this is where some adjustment of policy is required and where we should be speaking out much more in favor of the need for this reconciliation, or at least the development of some common ground between the two sides. And I think we should speak on these issues. And secondly, I think while His Holiness is with us, I think that is where the scope for dialogue lies. And I agree with you, it can't be the Central Tibetan Administration, it can't be the Sikyong leading these talks. It has to be something that emanates from His Holiness. And he, I think, can speak to Xi Jinping as, this is a dialogue of equals, literally. Although, on one side, the Chinese leadership is not exactly somebody you would equate with holiness or spirituality.
Thank you. Ms. Yudon Okatsang, you wanted to add something? Please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Amitabh and Swati and Deepstrat, for giving me this opportunity to be on this webinar with such distinguished panels. I really want to learn from Ambassador Menon, and Kate Saunders is also there, who's a researcher for many, many years on Tibet. But I wanted to add here, because we're talking about India's position on Tibet and the Tibetan political struggle and the recognition of the Dalai Lama. I think it's right that Ambassador Menon has pointed out that India has formally accepted the sovereignty of People's Republic of China over Tibet with the Panchsheel Agreement in 1954, as she mentioned. And also in 2003, it was reiterated with the Vajpayee and Wen Jiabao Declaration. But despite these stated policy, I wanted to really make it a point here to mention that Indian government, irrespective of any political party that came into power, has really been very, very accommodating in its approach to Tibet and Tibetans, allowing the Tibetan government in exile, officially known as the Central Tibetan Administration, to fully function and carry out its operations. We are actually very, very, I feel very indebted as a Tibetan member of parliament and also as a Tibetan to the government and people of India for their genuine and unwavering support in not only rehabilitating us here, but also contributing largely to help us flourish, both individually and collectively, and also being able to sustain our voice and identity here in India. No country has done more for us than India, and India is and continues to be the hub of the Tibetan freedom movement in exile. And on the question of reincarnation of Dalai Lama, shall I call you ambassador or former ambassador? You're such an eminent person, former ambassador Menon actually read out His Holiness's public statement, which he made on September 2011. And I think, although the government of India, as Amitabh mentioned, has been silent on this, but I think when the time comes, when His Holiness, as he says, he's 87 now, he'll be 90 in 2-3 years, he is going to make his position very clear. And I'm sure, and I'm confident that India will support whatever stand His Holiness takes. And also, I wanted to make a point very clear that when Amitabh was mentioning about, atheist China interfering in the meddling of the reincarnation of His Holiness and other high lamas, there will be a separation. You said based on the 2 Dalai Lamas that might come up in the future, there might be a lot of, kind of angst within the Tibetans, but that's not true only about the Tibetans. It's about the Buddhist world, and more importantly, Buddhist Indians. I think there are about 8.5 million Buddhists in India, in Maharashtra, in Ladakh, in Arunachal, in Himachal, in Sikkim, all that, I think India must take the reincarnation of Dalai Lama very seriously, because India has a population that has a huge reverence and devotion to His Holiness. And as Amitabh said, His Holiness might be born in India as well. So India does have a huge role to play, and I'm sure it will play a role and will support the stand that His Holiness will take. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sharab, you're next, and you're the last person on this question. Then we'll move on. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Chester, everyone. Thank you, Deepstrat, Amitabhji, everyone on the panel to have me here. I think when Ambassador Rao mentioned that she's far away from Delhi, but then in Bangalore she is very close to the largest Tibetan settlement. So it's probably more pertinent to the discussion that we are having today. I think going back to what Amitabhji said, of having this larger goal of whether Tibet is to the government of India or for the people of India to agree that or to state that India is an occupied country. I think Ambassador Rao also kind of leaned towards the 1954 agreement pact, but much before that, in 47, when India was a fresh and newly independent country, when you had the Asian Relations Conference, Tibet was invited as an independent country. Representatives of the government of Tibet were invited as any other country that was invited there. And then our relationships just don't go back to a few decades. We go back centuries of peaceful relationship, where we also have to consider that when right now we are talking about whether Tibet should be recognized as an occupied country, it is not just about the Tibetan people or not just about the Tibetan plateau. It is more about the 3,500 kilometers of open wound of a border that you have, that you did not inherit, but you might want to choose now to have for many more years or many more decades to come. So I think these questions, and also for middle way approach, if you accept middle way approach, it does not agree to the fact that Tibet is not an occupied country. So even if you're supporting middle way approach, the stand remains that the truth remains that Tibet is an occupied country, and perhaps it is time that the government of India does really have a very close real look on this. I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you. And just very quickly, as we said in the concept note, the Indian Himalayan Council of the Nalanda Buddhist tradition issued a statement in December 2022 in support of His Holiness deciding about the reincarnation. And then thank you for reminding us about the large Buddhist population in India and their relationship, both to Tibet, but also specifically to the current Dalai Lama. Okay, so we are now segueing into the next question, which is about international support for Tibet. So has it picked up in the last few years? Is it centered on the figure of the Dalai Lama? Is it likely to outlast him? How does the Tibetan community see the international support for Tibet? March is an important month. So that's, if anyone wants to refer to what happened just in the last month with all the important anniversaries. But I want to first give the floor to Kate, who's been patiently waiting. And I think you also wanted to come in on the previous question. So you have the floor, but for about 5 minutes. Okay, so please time yourself. So we have time for the next question too. Sorry to do that to you just off the bat, but please go ahead.
Not at all. And please stop me, Swati, if I go on too long. But thank you so much, Amitabh and Ambassador Rao and other esteemed guests. And I'm delighted to be here and talking about this topic, which is so crucial. So in answer to the question, I would say that yes, there has been an uptick, something of an uptick in support for Tibet globally. And I think that's due to a few reasons. Back in 2015, I was near Buckingham Palace when Xi Jinping rattled down the Mall in a horse-drawn carriage to meet the Queen. And I think that largely due to COVID and other factors, we won't be seeing that sort of red carpet welcome again. That was, of course, the golden era of UK-China relations. But now the British Parliament is banning TikTok and taking other similar initiatives. And I think this approach is continuing through Europe. There's a new questioning of China as a global power, and Xi Jinping in particular. I think also the Ukraine war has been a factor too, in which Tibetans also identify with that struggle against extinction by an authoritarian power. And so that has, perhaps there has been an argument in which Tibet has become perceived as one of the frontline states against authoritarianism threatening democracies worldwide. So I think also governments have largely seen Tibet over the last 10, 20 years as a matter of religious freedom or of human rights. And I think there's increasingly an awareness of the geopolitical significance, and panelists will be very aware of all of those factors. Water on Tibet's plateau regarded as a strategic asset by the PRC, directly impacting India. The natural mineral resources, lithium, copper, gold on the Tibetan plateau, and how Tibet is perceived as the southwestern frontier of the motherland. So very strategic interest, of course, for India, nowhere more so than in India. And I think it's worth remembering here that the front lines, the areas that saw fighting in the 1962 border war, directly over the border, there are these new border villages constructed that have been a priority under Xi Jinping's leadership on the other side of the border from AP. So also Tibet is a climate change epicenter, and many other reasons why it's regarded as an issue of importance. The Uyghur issue, since 2017, since this rightfully took prominence and the world became aware of the so-called re-education camps and the crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, I've spoken to a number of people from different governments who've said that in these few years, when the Uyghurs gained this prominence, that some focus was lost on that, but I think that does seem to be now coming back. And I think also as Chinese power expands across the Indo-Pacific, so it is also the intensification of power, geopolitical competition across the Himalayas. So for instance, in Britain, some months ago, there was a launch of a proposed geopolitical strategy for the Himalayas. And so that question is being discussed. I'd just like to add in relation to the first question, because I think this is such a relevant topic for all of us, which is India's role in the future. And just to remind, I suppose, that what the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans have contributed to India, and the cultural, religious, centuries-old connections that go back to the preservation of Nalanda Tibetan texts by Tibetan translators, by more than 700 Tibetan translators who went back and forth protecting those texts after they were destroyed, after the great library at Nalanda was destroyed. And now those same exponents of Tibetan culture and practitioners of Buddhism are now finding sanctuary in India. So a lot of deep cultural, historical resonance and connections there. And the Dalai Lama has led efforts, I think, to establish Tibetan Buddhism as the most complete and robust Buddhist tradition in India. All 4 major Tibetan Buddhist schools have their origins in Nalanda. So, and that contrasts with the Sinicization campaign inside Tibet, in which Xi Jinping is compelling Tibetans to he's seeking an elimination of a separate historic, political, cultural identity, and seeking to compel Tibetans to conform to this cultural nationalism. And one of the leading scholars in Tibet, Go Sherab Gyatso, who's currently in prison serving 10 years for his writings, described this as a cataclysm of forced integration. So I think it's really important for India to continue to acknowledge that this is a civilizational struggle for the Tibetan people. And one of the most serious challenges that they face for the future is maintaining the connections between the Tibetan Buddhist civilization inside Tibet, which so many Tibetans are still working so hard and so subtly and in such a sophisticated way to protect and preserve, to maintain those very fragile links with those Tibetans in exile who were also fighting for the continuation of their identity. So the continued support of the CTA, the legitimate representatives, and Tibetan Buddhist institutions across India is essential. And I always think in terms of speaking about the succession of the Dalai Lama, it's so important to speak of it not as some sort of future eventuality, but China's transnational repression is happening now, and its influence across the Himalayas is happening now. More than 50 million people in the Indian and Nepalese Himalaya who are largely Buddhist, largely loyal and devoted to the Dalai Lama, this great religious leader on the world stage, as well as within India. So it's very much in India's interests to take a strong position on this matter and to deal with China's interference in the succession process and in attempts to undermine Buddhist civilization now, not only in some undetermined point in the future.
Thank you, Kate. And actually on this question of what India owes to Tibetans and to the Dalai Lama in particular, again, many of you might know there's been a rising clamor in India to confer the highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, upon His Holiness. In fact, both Ambassador Rao and Amitav have spoken about that as well. So, okay. Ms. Yudon Oktsang, do you want to come in on this question about international support before we move on to the next one? Yes, about a minute or two.
Can you hear me, Swati?
Yes, we can. Just
I think I missed a point in the previous question. I think since 2010, India has also been quite cautious not to use that one China policy in its official documents. If Ambassador Menon and Amitav Mathur would agree to me, that I've found in my research that since 2010, India has been quite cautious not to use one China policy, because China actually is, using this term, interchangeably to really mean respecting the territorial integrity of China, which also includes its claims over the disputed Indo-Tibet border. Here, I want to stress Indo-Tibet border, because at times when we write in different articles in India, also people tend to say Sino-Indian border, but it actually is Indo-Tibet border. And we also have Indo-Tibetan border police. So going back to the second question, which Swati, you asked about international support for Tibet, I would say that the biggest factor in recent times is the profound shift in the way the world has now looks at China. The kind of power China has become, its ambitions to change the global world order to suit its agenda, has really, I think, woken up the international governments, particularly in the West, the Western liberal democracies, to really find ways to counter China. And of course, India has had this long-standing, aggression in the border with China, which has increased in recent times, and also the Taiwan Strait problems, the Mongolia problems, South China Sea, Southeast Asia, you name it, all the problems that China has been creating since its rise to power, this kind of arrogance and this bullying kind of stance, aggressive stance that China is taking. And because of that, I think there is no doubt that there is this opportunity for us to garner more support for Tibet. But we need to do that in partnership with all the groups that are fighting to counter China, whether it's the groups like East Turkestan groups, the Hong Kongers, or the governments, the Western governments in the forefront. And of course, India has a long-term kind of tensions, which has remained and which will remain for a long time. We need to counter China together. Not Tibet alone, Tibetans alone cannot do it. But since
she had warned us power might go off. Unfortunately, it went off as she was speaking. So I'll just wait another 10-15 seconds just in case. And we can all take a little breather. And then we'll move on to the third question, and maybe she can come back in.
Maybe I can just come in briefly.
Please, please.
When you're talking about the preservation of Tibetan identity, the Tibetan language service of All India Radio used to be such a beacon in past years. And I don't know to what extent it continues to relay its broadcasts into Tibet and at least can be heard in our border regions. I think that was one point. And secondly, our universities and our teaching institutions and academic centers, I think, can certainly start Tibetan studies programs. I think we need much more concentration of scholarship in these areas, just heighten the awareness about Tibet, about its unique identity among and among Indian the young demographic particularly. And that would also be means to integrate the Tibetan refugee community more closely within Indian mainstream.
And again, sorry to be the nerdy professor, but this is a great volume on Tibetan studies in India, past and present, and the role that Indian universities have played. So exactly to your point, Ambassador Rao, I mean, starting from Vishwabharati, even before the days of exile. So I think that's also a slice of history that we often forget. And some of us now today, I'm in a university space, I think Sonika Gupta, Madhura are here from IIT Madras, the Tibetscape Center, Swargajyoti Gohain at Ashoka, quite a few universities in North Bengal, in Sikkim. So I think that's another piece of this that, we perhaps should do another webinar on, but thank you for raising that. We now move to the final question, and there's also a question on the chat to this by Ravi Joshi on what are the hopes and anxieties. That's also the title of the webinar, of Tibetans in India, and what is it that they expect from India, from the government, and from Indians, from Indian people. So Sherab, you are first on that, and if I hope Ms. Yudon Okatsang is able to come back. So you have about 5 minutes. It's the last question, and then maybe we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay, over to you, Sherab.
Thank you, Swatiji. Please let me know if I exceed my time.
I will.
Right. Hopes and anxieties, generally speaking, Tibetans are notoriously optimists. So we are always hopeful. We're always hopeful that, something will happen and that change will occur. And then we actively work towards making those change happen. So as for anxieties, His Holiness Dalai Lama always repeats, Shantideva was saying that, if there's a solution to the problem, why worry? If there's no solution to the problem, what's the use of worrying, right? So, but nevertheless, talking about the realities of exile life, I think challenges that there are many, anxieties there are many, and well, His Holiness calls himself, son of India, and that technically kind of makes us, grand or great grandsons and daughters of India. Also, I was born here in India. I studied NCRT syllabus. I went to an Indian college. I've been working here for the past almost 20 years. And as Yudala was earlier mentioning, the Tibetans, our feeling of really gratefulness and how indebted we are to the support that, governments of, governments have provided, the state governments and the central governments and the people of India have provided to the Tibetan people. We are truly indebted. And therefore, it is not just my responsibility or obligation to thank you, but also to speak up and to make you aware and make, because Tibetans know the Chinese, I think, apart from the Chinese people who suffer under the Chinese regime, Tibetans know the Chinese regime best, I think. We have, spent 70 years dealing with China. We have had the experience of, terrible experience of having many of us, perished under the regime. Yet still, there are thousands of Tibetans right now who are studying in Chinese schools. There are hundreds of Tibetans who are working for the Chinese government. And, and that's therefore, Tibetans are the link where, if you want to understand how China works, how China plans, how China strategizes, I think it is Tibetans are an asset. And therefore, I think for us also to foreground that potential that we have, I think it's very important. So therefore, going back to the initial discussion on, whether it is time now that the government of India should consider Tibet as an occupied country or not, I think that should be seriously taken up. Secondly, Ambassador Rao was mentioning about this tacit kind of recognition to the CTA as an exile government. I think maybe right now is also the time for the Indian government to actually recognize the CTA as the legitimate exile government of the Tibetan people. And also, we have been talking about the number of Tibetans the limitations on those of, and the Nepal after 2019, Xi's visit to Nepal, I think the situation has become much worse for Tibetans to be able to come out. Is it time now to again rethink of opening, having a land border opened with Tibet, where Tibetans can escape? I think that's also something that needs to be considered. So the multiple issues that we need to look at when you talk about our aspirations and our hopes. And Amitabhji earlier mentioned about whether how many Tibetans would actually return to Tibet if there was an event, if there was a possibility. I think that question would largely depend upon what kind of a Tibet are we returning to. Is that Tibet more kind of restrictive than the freedom that we enjoy in India? If that is the case, then that is something people might not make that choice. But if we are returning to a free and an independent Tibet, I think there's no question that a large majority of the Tibetans will again choose to return to Tibet. So and then Ambassador Rao also was mentioning about more scholarships on Tibet, more scholarship in the universities on Tibetan studies. I think it's also high time that we recognize the knowledge production of the Tibetans in exile, and these monasteries that were built, of course, with the help of the government of India and with support from all over the world. The repository of knowledge that we have, been able to preserve over the years. I think maybe some of those monasteries should be given deemed university status, so that there's more exchange of Buddhism studies, not just within India but also outside India, and then which onwards could help building more relationships. That I think in the coming few weeks we are organizing, in a sense, the Indian Confederation for Buddhists is organizing this global summit on Buddhism, right? So these are all steps towards this direction that we see. But then why are we not able to capitalize on those steps? Why is Tibet not a part of those larger plannings, those larger goals that India strategically has? So and then of course in 2014 we had the Tibetan rehabilitation policy. I think now is the time where the government of India needs to review that policy, in consultation with the Tibetan people, see how beneficial has it been, what are the ways we can improve those policies, what are the ways in which we can make settlements more viable, we can make, the knowledge economy of the Tibetan population can be, the potential can be captured in those settlements. So the rehabilitation policy review, if that happens, this could address many of those challenges, many of those issues that we living in India, know for sure that, this could be something that we can work on together. And talking about, Buddhism, the influence of Buddhism, I think it's, the 17th Karmapa Ugintile Dorje's status, his possibility of returning to India, of meeting the Dalai Lama. I think these are very pertinent questions that we should have a serious thought about, and still kind of sidelining and try kind of this way of where we have not given the recognition or the respect that he deserved. And I think maybe it is time again to look over that and then see, not just the Karmapa Lama, but then also the other high-ranking lamas. How much of security do they feel actually of being able to stay in India beyond a time when His Holiness might not be here with us? So these are also questions that we need to understand and strategize and plan for. I think, and maybe I'm running out of time now. So Ambassador Rao was earlier mentioning about Sardar Patel, and then in the letter to Pandit Nehru, Patelji mentioned that Tibetans chose to trust and to be guided by India. 70 years later, I think we still choose to be guided by India. And then the fact now is that India is not that India of past 70 years, and we hope and we really aspire that India will be able to make a decision that is strong, that is forward-looking, and that is strategic for Tibet. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharab. Amitabh, do you want to quickly come in on the Karmapa and the High Lamas? And then I think Ms. Yudon Okatsang has joined us only on audio. She could have the last, also now on video, she could have the last word after Amitabh, and then we open for Q&A. Amitabh, 2 minutes. Sorry, so sorry.
Yes, thank you, Sharaf, for raising this. I think there's been a basic drawback in our treatment of the high-ranking lamas over here. Our spiritual, religious contacts with Tibet have been age-old. But fact of the matter is, an intensive interaction has taken place with them only after 1959 when they came to India. Now, senior lineages like the Karmapas have had hundreds of years of intense relationship with the Chinese, with the Han Chinese, with the Ming Dynasty. So over here, the security apparatus, unfortunately, views any contact with the Chinese in a very negative sense. And hence, sometimes we err in our treatment of high-ranking lamas, not just the 17th Karmapa Ogun Tenle Dorji, but many others. And that has caused damage to everything. I think the image of India as a safe haven for Tibetans suffers. And the fact that we should have the head of the Karma Kaju school of Tibetan Buddhism in India, that too. Conditions that led to the Karmapa to leave the country must not be recreated. We must learn from that experience. But I think now the ball is really in his court, if I can, from what I hear from his Lebrun. He has an open invitation to return, and I hope he will avail of it and come back and put his shoulder behind His Holiness Dalai Lama.
Thank you. Ms. Yudonoksang, welcome back. You have the last word.
Thank you. Is this, oh yeah, so I guess we addressing the question on, in continuation of what I was saying, because I missed out because of the power shutout. You know, the Central Tibetan Administration has now, I think I'm trying to address the point that Ambassador Menon was making when she said that something has to give. There has been a deadlock in the dialogue between China and Tibet in resolving the Tibet-China conflict since 2010. So what is necessary and what the Central Tibetan Administration is now doing as a renewed focus on our advocacy is really to promote the recognition of Tibetan people's right to self-determination under international law. I think it's very important because based on the fact that Tibet was historically never a part of China, and that's something we would like countries like, of course, in the West just now, there is in the US, there is a bill that's being tabled, which really does talk about this, that Tibet was historically never a part of China and is currently under illegal occupation. And based on that, we are also saying that we assert our rights to self-determination under international law. I think unless we assert this right and unless we get recognition from countries that Tibet was historically never a part of China, the dialogue process, there will not be any leverage to really pursue the dialogue based on the middle way approach. We do want peaceful resolution to the Tibet-China conflict, but for that, I think it's totally pertinent because China is making that the main issue. The crux of the matter for China is that it is trying to spin this narrative that Tibet was historically a part of China. And their claim to Tibet, the sovereignty over Tibet, is also based on this fact that Tibet was historically a part of China, which is not true. We all know there have been, in the last recent times, there have been many scholars, including Chinese scholars, which have proved that China's claim to Tibet since the Mongol Yuan dynasty is also false, because Tibet was not ruled with China under the Mongol Yuan dynasty. In fact, Tibet had a very special relationship with them. Tibet was under the influence of the Yuan Mongol dynasty, but was never ruled. And China is clearly glossing over that fact that it was under alien occupation, under the Manchu emperors, under the Mongolian rulers, but it's claiming its sovereignty over Tibet based on the fact that China has inherited Tibet from the Mongol Yuan dynasty. So I think now in our advocacy, we need to really, I mean, in the past, we took it for granted that it was understood that Tibet was historically never a part of China. We never really asserted it, but I think it's very, very important for us to do so. The Sikyong is doing it, the Tibetan parliament is doing it. And if you see the bill that the bipartisan bill that the US government is bringing forward in amendment to the Tibet Policy Act of 2002 is also bringing it out, saying that we recognize the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. We also recognize that the legal status of Tibet is unresolved and needs resolving. And the fact that because Tibet was is occupied by China, Tibetan people. China also has legal obligation really to resolve the Tibet conflict, and so does the international community. Because under the United Nations General Assembly resolution of 1961 also, the international community recognized the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. So we need to reiterate all this, which we haven't done very systematically. I think it's very, very important to do that. And also the fact that His Holiness's reincarnation is being the interference of China in this. That needs to be denounced. And that is something that we've been bringing up, and we need to bring up, very, very consistently. And one other important aspect that is in our advocacy now is really to condemn the oppressive, of course, it has always been the oppressive policies implemented by the Chinese in Tibet, particularly the reports that we've had or in recent times on forced assimilation of Tibetans, of young Tibetans. We've also heard reports and alarm mentioned by the UN experts on 1 million Tibetan children, which is, almost 80% of the Tibetan population in the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. They are being forcefully taken away from their homes and being sent to these colonial boarding schools where they are being indoctrinated in Chinese thought, in Chinese language, and uprooted from their identity, their roots. China is really trying to, in so many words, as Xi Jinping said, about, kind of creating this one China kind of thing where everybody speaks the same language, has the same ideology, and is serving the Chinese nationalistic goals. So that, I think, is something that we need to be more vociferous about, and we've been doing that.
Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists. I'm now going to pool in the questions. So two big questions, I think, one for Ambassador Rao and for Amitabh, or you could both come in. There's a question that Sherab had raised about India's Tibet policy, and I think Sonika had echoed. Sorry, I am also scrolling up the chat. There is an urgent need to recalibrate the Tibetan rehabilitation policy. And Amitabh, I also wanted to ask you what happened to the advisory position, to the MHA after you retired, like what's happening? I think you had offered to get us up to date on that. And then there's a question to Professor Rao for both Vijay Kranti and Sonika Gupta about whether India needs to rethink its policy towards Tibet in the light of the reincarnation issue, and also perhaps turning the clock back, recognizing the CTA, de-recognizing Tibet as a part of China. I think you partly addressed that, Ambassador Rao, in your remarks, but if you wanted to add something. So Amitabh first, and then Ambassador Rao, and then if there are
Can we have Ambassador Rao first? Because
first,
she
all
also
right,
has a
sure.
time.
I think you also have a
commitment.
Yes, and we will end at, before 6:30 for sure. But Ambassador Rao, if you want to come in first, please.
Yeah, I was unmuting it. Well, I've always been an advocate of, I totally believe in the Tibetan people, and I've been a long-time champion and supporter of their cause. But I also see, by virtue of my own experience in the field, literally as a practitioner, that there is need for more realism. And the old Tibet literally has been undone. That is the tragedy of our times, I'm afraid. So the only realistic hope is for this dialogue between the Tibetan establishment, led by His Holiness, really, while he is there with us, and we are blessed with his presence, to undertake with the Chinese Communist Party and with the Chinese government. I don't believe, and we have not in this discussion touched upon the situation on the border between India and the Tibetan region. A part of that border also covers the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. So it's not entirely an Indo-Tibetan border, as was said. There is also a section that deals with Xinjiang. So for the purposes of perhaps of of convenience, we call it the India-China border. We don't call it the Uttaranchal Tibet border, or we don't call it the Himachal Tibet border, or we don't call it the Arunachal Tibet border, or the Ladakh Xinjiang border. So I think it comes under that rubric, India-China border. And let us view that situation enormously fluid, enormously tense, and you know, with the shadow of conflict that is thrown across the entire length of it. I think the preoccupation today in Delhi, and I'm sure with the government, is with this situation. How are we going to diffuse the situation? How are we going to ensure that there will not be full-blown conflict between India and China? How do we preserve our territory from further Chinese transgression? So I think that has really become front and center of the preoccupations in the government of India and Delhi. Of course, the question of His Holiness's reincarnation will continue to occupy the debate and the discussion among all thinking people who are concerned about what happens in Tibet. And I think our connection, although our connection with Tibet goes back to so many centuries, back to the Nalanda tradition, which we didn't speak much about today. But the fact is, the present problem, if you can call it as such, or the issue of Tibetans in India really stems from the flight of His Holiness into India in March 1959 and the exodus of Tibetan refugees into India. So it is a refugee issue that we face. It is the question of the presence of His Holiness here. We always say he's a respected religious and spiritual figure, that we don't see him as a political figure, but we definitely see him as a leader of the Tibetan people. And when you talk of reincarnation, obviously that is something that His Holiness himself will probably pronounce on in the near future. Let us see what he has to say. There will definitely be Chinese attempts to impose a so-called reincarnation as they define it from their side on the Tibetans. That will definitely not be accepted, I'm sure. So the issue will continue to remain alive. But the larger question of the identity of the Tibetan people, the welfare of the Tibetan people, that is something that India can uphold, can preserve, which means that our whole policy towards the community here, the refugee community, has to be focused on, has to be improved, and you brought up the question of Ugyen Tenle Dorji, the Karmapa, and the whole treatment of him. And I know from my own experience that His Holiness was very fond of him and wanted perhaps to give him that position that would enable him to, in a sense, be that kind of emanation, as you call it, not perhaps the reincarnation, but an emanation of what perhaps the spirituality and the message that perhaps I would say His Holiness wanted to transmit to Tibetans and to the people across the world through this young the young persona of the Karmapa coming across into India. The suspicions of his Chinese connections perhaps are what really spoilt the scenario as far as that is concerned. Amitabh mentioned that there is scope for him to return. And as I understand, he's a man of wisdom and he could speak in many ways for the future of the Tibetan people. And wishes him well.
Yeah. Thank you. Kate, I believe you wanted to come in before we go to Amitabh, and then we can only take one more question. We're going to take Kaveri's question, and I'll invite Sherab and Yudon to come in on that, and that's all we might have time for. So sorry about that, those of you who've been waiting to ask your questions. Kate.
Oh, just a couple of points. I think that China's elaborate plans to deal with the succession in what they call the post-Dalai era, they call what we're in now as the late Dalai era, are at least a result partially of the success of the Dalai Lama and his outsized influence, both on a global stage and across the Himalayas, across the Tibetan Buddhist world, the Buddhist world, encompassing not only India and the Himalayas, but also Japan, Mongolia, Vietnam, and the West and US, of course, as well. So I think that he's demonstrated beyond all doubt the value, the global value of Tibetan culture, which is essential if the world is going to try to preserve it. And he's also brought to the world the concepts of secular ethics, of universal responsibility. He's introduced compassion into global educational curricula. So very, very important. And when I was in Kathmandu recently, I noticed that despite the immense pressures there on the Nepalese government and on the Tibetan community, the very unsettled status of Tibetans there and the risks that they face, it's the Tibetan religious teachers and masters who are really holding the space for the protection of Tibetan culture and identity there in Nepal. And one of the older lamas there, he took 38 buses full of Nepalese Himalayan Buddhists to Bodh Gaya to meet the Dalai Lama. So, and those Nepalese Buddhists go back to their communities and they talk about what they experienced, and so the teachings impact them in that way. So that is dialogue and engagement, but it's a different form of dialogue and engagement, but an essential one to develop in both India and Nepal as we go forward. And just to finish up also by very much affirming what Sharabosa has said, all of those very practical points of engagement. There's a group of Tibetans, many thousands of Tibetans actually, Tibetans who came from Tibet, who managed to escape across the Himalayas in the 90s and in the 2000s as well. And these Tibetans, often their language, they're often tricultural. They have Tibetan, Chinese, English language as well, and they have a really a lived experience of the Tibetan landscape and of Chinese politics. And as Sharabosa very eloquently said, these are the people that we can learn from about China now, and those are the individuals who have often been sidelined in India and who have been under suspicion in India. And an opportunity now exists, I think, to engage them strategically in a much more direct way than before.
Thank you, Kate. Amitabh, did you want to come in briefly?
I think on the issue, Ambassador Rao has already said what needs to be said. On the issue of reincarnation, I will just add one thing, that there are so many possibilities His Holiness has spoken of, including that there may not be continuation of the institution of the Dalai Lama, but that will not prevent the Chinese from imposing one of their own. So I think regardless of that, I think the Indian establishment needs to engage with His Holiness as to what his wishes are. And to the limited extent, we can always issue a statement saying that India is a secular country and this is a religious matter, and this religious matter rests between it's within for the Tibetans to decide and His Holiness to advise. So I think that needs to be done. Secondly, I think for the foreseeable future, the religious leaders are going to play an important role. Maybe not as important as they used to in the 60s, 70s and all that. But I would second what Kate has said, that we need to revise the way we deal with the religious leaders over here. I think their contacts with their age-old contacts in the mainland China, they are not security suspects, they are actually strategic assets. And I've always believed that greater contact between them and the Chinese Buddhists, and the greater contact between us and the Chinese Buddhists, and the growth of Buddhism in China is to our advantage, not to our disadvantage.
Thank you. Last question from Kaveri. How does the younger generation of Tibetans truly feel about staying on in India? So Sherab and Ms. Vidun Okatsang, if you could each come in on this for about a minute and a half. And that's it. I will stop you because we need to end at 6:30. Thank you. Sherab, over to you.
Thank you. I think the reason, probably we have to look at the reason why people choose to leave, I think, and that's basically financial security and stability in life. I think these are the main reasons. And if they find and see potential and hope that, living here where you were born and where your parents are and where your roots are, in a way, probably there is a very good chance that, we can not just trying to address the symptoms, but trying to address the cause of the problem. Maybe there's a hope. And then, recently there was a opening here in Dharamshala for around 10 positions, and then there are 80 people showed up, so there is still people around, who want to work and who want to use their, best of knowledge, serving the community. Just half a minute, I think, going back to the whole reincarnation issue, I think it is, as Ambassador read out from the statement that of His Holiness, I think he said around 90, so it's still a few more years. I think we can be patient, but at the same time, as Mathurji was pointing out, if we see this huge, useless issue with 2 pension lamas, right? So it is not serving any purpose for either of us, So instead, if China understands from now on that, countries that have major concerns, that have major stakeholders like India, the US, the West, are all supporting whatever the reincarnation process or whatever happens, leaves it up to His Holiness, then there is probably, this will be a deterrence to China to come up with a random decision, because they know that even before they played the ball, it's not going to it's not going to be of any use to them. So I think that way, and also the Taiwanese former President Maijo's visit to China, I think that's also very interesting, something that we are trying to keep a close eye on, and how much of a reception he gets when he goes back to Taiwan also. I think these are all interesting things that we need to look at.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Yudanakatsang, just about a minute and a half, and then we
Swati, I'm just going to continue from that where Amitabh and Shera both left off, that India must take its rightful place, I think, in all matters pertaining to Buddhism, because India has intrinsic ties to Buddhism, and India, therefore, I think, with also the population that is, the increasing population of Buddhists in India, India really must endorse the Dalai Lama's stand on his reincarnation. That is something I strongly kind of advocate for. And the fact that the question that you're asking is, and with that regard also, I think the conferment of Bharat Ratna is something that Tibetans in India would like the Indian government should consider. I think it's at long overdue, I think, and why, I think with the young people, I feel that there are, I think it's very pertinent that Tibetans must be retained. More young Tibetans must be in India, because India is the hub of the Tibetan freedom movement. And for that to happen, I think what needs to also happen is the way the Tibetans are here under the Foreigners Registration Act, with the registration certificate and the identity card for travel. I think we need to really break down some of the formalities also for people to travel. It's especially with regard to the identity card, which is used by Tibetans to travel. The bulk of the Tibetans use that to travel. And there are so many layers of bureaucracy that they have to apply for, exit permit, and there is no objection to return to India stamp. Then when they come back, they need return visa. I think all that some of that we could either simplify or make redundant and make it simpler for Tibetans to travel. And also under the rehabilitation policy, I think if it could be uniformly implemented, and the Tibetans are really leaving India for better prospects, I think. So if we can have better prospects in India, I'm sure Tibetans will be here, because India is, there's a deep emotional bond and spiritual bond with India, and many of us are here. And we believe that we are, our freedom movement is here, the hub is here, and we need to be here to kind of continue the movement. It's very important.
I think,
Yes.
Swati, also perhaps just a final note, that maybe the time has come for a high-ranking official of the Indian government to make perhaps a policy speech on where we stand on the whole Tibetan issue. Not in terms of saying Tibet is occupied territory or that we want Tibetan freedom. I'm not saying that, but the whole aspect of 60 years on, 62 years, this whole issue, and how do we see the future for the community here, and preservation of Tibetan identity, and what Amitabh mentioned about the question of reincarnation, that it has to be an issue that has to be decided by His Holiness and the high-ranking Tibetan establishment about how the future should lie, but in the context of our relations with China, where we stand on this issue.
Right. And I just want to end with saying how His Holiness often says that 6 decades of eating dal-bhat, his body is Indian, and his mind that is informed by the Nalanda masters is also Indian. So I think just want to end on that note and thank everybody, all our panelists. Thank you, Amitabh, Shaukat, Mr. Azad, and in particular, the amazing team at Deepstrat that's made it happen, Shachi, Utkarsh, Gauri, and Kriti, that did all the heavy lifting and the back-end work. Thanks to our very engaged audience, about 116 people had registered, and we've had a really lively discussion. So thank you very much, and we hope to continue these conversations later. We will be putting up a recording of this. So look out for that announcement and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Okay, bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
you.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati.
Thank you. Thanks, Shaukat.
Sharab,
Thank you.
Thank
do
you.
give
Thank
me
you,
a
sir.
shout when you're here from Dharamshala, Sharab.
Sure, sir, I will. Any plans of you coming up?
Well, I want to. Maybe
Uh-huh.
end April, I might just come up.
All right. Thank you for sharing the good news on Karmapa. I didn't know that.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay.
Right, bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.